I'd now like to introduce you to today's presenter, Micah Modell. Micah is a senior instructional designer and manager at GP Strategies. He earned his PhD in instructional systems technology at Indiana University. He has a background in software development, and his research focus is on collaborative group work. Micah particularly enjoys designing innovative solutions to performance needs. So with that, Micah, I will go ahead and turn presenter rights over to you.
Thank you. So welcome. Thank you very much, Kayla. Welcome. Again, my name is Micah Modell, and I'm a senior instructional designer with GP Strategies. My research into collaboration earned me a PhD in instructional systems technology. Over the next 20 minutes or so, we'll look at what we know about groups and, more specifically, what we know about when things go wrong with groups. I began this adventure as an effort to provide a method to support instructors in their use of long-term collaborative learning group projects. But what I learned was that I didn't really understand the problem. My biggest takeaway from the 3 years which constituted the study is that facilitators lack a playbook for smoothing out the operations of their teams. But I get a little bit ahead of myself. In my own teaching, I found that learners engaged in group work often report doing all the work while others would take all the credit, or maybe that teammates never let them do anything on the project. But was that really true? I'm sure they felt it, but what about their teammates? Would they report the same thing? If it was true, what should I do about it? Is that just necessary? Is that a learning experience? Should we be doing anything about it? When I asked my colleagues and reviewed the literature, I found precious little on the topic at all. There was a whole lot on the benefits of group work and how to design group projects so that they run optimally, but they don't always run optimally. And there really wasn't much on what to do when they seem to go wrong. This is the foundation of a rich research agenda that begins in higher education, but which has clear implications for the workplace, both from training and management perspectives. This webinar will present the implications and practical application of what we've learned so far. So now here's the audience participation piece. By a show of virtual hands, how many of you are engaged in teamwork right now? And I'm trying to pull up the, okay, so I see some hands going up. And how many of you have ever worked in as part of a team professionally? Looks like we've got some more hands going up. So collaborative group projects are increasingly used in higher education for a variety of reasons, not least of which is, as you just demonstrated, the increasing prevalence of teams in professional life. This is for a variety of reasons, including the fact that groups offer us increased manpower to tackle large problems in a relatively reasonable amount of time. But it also provides us with multiple perspectives, which leads to, or should lead to, better vetted and more creative solutions to a problem that come from those alternative perspectives. Quite frankly, the creative solutions are why I really like group work. However, while I'd had positive experiences with group work myself, both my peers and my students were quite vocal about dreading it. This wasn't universal, but there was a significant number of people who, as soon as they hear group project, they groan. Dysfunction happens often, at least according to anecdotal evidence, and or at least people seem to think that it does. What's more, if students are not all contributing to the project, they're not getting the experience they need to learn the material. Most important, it's difficult to track the dynamics of and really know what's happening in our groups, and it's tough to address problems that you can't identify. Before we go further, let me take a moment to sync up on some terms. First of all, collaboration seems sort of obvious, but let's make sure we're all synced up. It refers to individuals working together toward a shared goal, co-negotiating roles and process along the way as presumed equals, right? So they're supposed to be bringing effectively the same things to the table. It's never going to be entirely equal, but close. A small group consists of 3 to 5 individuals working together. And I'm interested in long-term collaborative learning group projects, which are small groups of students collaborating on the completion of a project for the purposes of learning over the course of 8 weeks or more. So not like a 1-hour brainstorming session, but something that's longer term than that. And then finally, dysfunctional group behaviors are patterns of group interactions which can be recognized and which detract from one or more participants' experiences. Here we have a list of various dysfunctional behaviors that I've been able to collect, and we've got the usual suspects: social loafing or free riding is what seems to come up most often, and it's where a student does not appear to be doing their fair share of the work on the project. Some make a distinction between the two labels, social loafing and free riding, based upon student motivation or intent, but from a learning perspective, the effect is that that student or students are not practicing the skills that we intend for them to practice. Group domination is another commonly reported situation, and in it, one member enforces their vision or imposes their vision of the project by browbeating others or belittling their contributions unless it's in line with their own vision. This can, of course, be very demoralizing, as well as detracting from the opportunity to practice and express their skills. Then we're going to go on to leave it to George and sucker effect, which represent alternative paths that might be taken when one member is significantly more capable than the rest. As we said, collaboration, they're presumed equals, but they're not always. And in the former, right, in leave it to George, the stronger student winds up taking on virtually the whole project because they're better at it. In the latter, the stronger student recognizes this pattern emerging and then stops taking on project work because they don't want to be made a sucker. Some of you may have noted that these behaviors might also be viewed as group domination or social loafing, respectively, from the proper perspective. In the interest of time, I'll be happy to revisit any of these behaviors on the list during the Q&A session, but the important thing to note is that there are many possible situations that can affect individual learning or group output, or both, and some of them might be perceived differently from different perspectives. With all of that as our backdrop, we're embarking on research to better understand the situation. In an exploratory study, I aimed to understand how instructors approach collaborative group dysfunction among undergraduate students. I did this by asking instructors to diagnose one of 3 group work scenarios as conveyed through their reflections, as conveyed by the reflections of a group member. Now, these group members that they were reading were the scenarios which reflected equal participation, group domination, and social loafing. They were all fictional accounts depicting behaviors that were drawn from descriptions in the literature. Participants in the study were instructors in higher education, representing at least 30 U.S. states, and you may notice that I'm switching back and forth to use the term instructor now instead of facilitator, and that's reflecting the fact that my participants were from higher ed. But give me a moment, because I'll tie it all together to a more corporate audience in short order. The study itself yielded some interesting results. My first question asked simply, if instructors can spot dysfunction of any kind. Do they know when they're looking at a group that's experiencing healthy ups and downs versus one that's having problems? And the research said no. 75% of the time, my participants said that that the group they were looking at was healthy, when only 1/3 actually were. That means that roughly 40% of the time, they were looking right at a dysfunctional situation, and they didn't see it. However, when they did determine, going on to question number 2, when they did determine that a dysfunction was present, the diagnosis was generally in line with the dysfunction that was being modeled. There was one instance where they said they didn't know, and one instance where they there were a couple of instances that were off, but generally speaking, they were in line. The last 2 questions aim to dig a bit deeper and understand how they go about making these determinations in order to understand the results we got. And interviews with the instructors showed that they paid attention to different aspects of the scenarios and employed a variety of different strategies. Sometimes they'd seem to sort of, calculate and evaluate individuals' participation and individuals' contributions and, add them up and weigh them out in order to figure things out. Sometimes they'd use a sort of process of elimination approach. Well, there's no domination going on. Other times, they compared situations to their own past experiences for guidance. The big thing is that there wasn't consistency in how they approached the task or in the strategies that they used to evaluate. All of this indicates that while there's lots of guidance on how to structure group projects for optimal collaboration, there's little to no training on how to identify group problems when they occur. And again, it's difficult to come to resolution if you don't really know what's going on. All of this means a few things for us, but primarily it means that instructors don't have a consistent approach to using this increasingly common method, that method being collaborative learning groups. There's no shared playbook. As a result, we're sort of collectively repeating the same experiments on our students as we develop our own variations on this method. We seem to use this method as a tool to achieve our own ends without recognizing its place in the greater system that is our students' development. And as a result, we're not only neglecting to impart valuable skills to our students, but we actually seem to be teaching many of them to dislike collaboration. Let me repeat that. Not only aren't undergrads being taught how to perform well in collaborative groups, but they are effectively being taught to dislike trying to do so. Naturally, in the professional world, this means that we may be fighting a bit of an uphill battle with many of our colleagues and employees if we ask them to work on a team. So where does that leave us? What can we actually do about this? Fortunately, there are some things we can do. For one thing, we can work to support our teams with professional development for our team's facilitators. This might take the form of seminars or symposia or dedicated discussion forums where they can share their experiences and learn from one another. Long-term group projects aren't often used for primarily learning purposes in the corporate world, but when they are, we need to make sure we go beyond specifying the content goals and also specify the collaboration goals. Why are we using it this time? What do we expect of our learners? Why collaboration? Why not just let them do it all by themselves? We also must make sure that we're monitoring multiple streams of information to have any chance at knowing what our teams are experiencing and to be able to act when problems arise. And finally, while we always hope that our interventions come off without a hitch, we must be prepared with how we'll act when, not if, dysfunction does show itself. Will we intervene? How will we intervene? Why are we going to intervene? For what reasons? What purpose does it serve for the performer or for the learner? And is it for a learning purpose, or is it just for their comfort? Both of those are legitimate, but what are we doing it for in this particular case? Similar recommendations can be applied directly to work teams, starting with spreading awareness. Make sure that our managers are aware of the possibility of group dysfunction and what it might look like, and give them a forum for sharing their experiences, specifically around group work. Make sure that they know that the members of their team are likely to be carrying a lot of baggage with them, and it's not unreasonable that they may have to do some work to overcome that. Make sure that managers are monitoring their teams, but also make sure that they know that there's a good chance they won't recognize a dysfunction for what it is, even when they're staring right at it. Encourage managers to discuss and seek a second opinion. To discuss with each other and seek a second opinion. And finally, and I know that this is a little bit self-serving on my part, but monitor the research on the topic and make sure your facilitators and managers are doing the same. Spread that information around. Make sure that we are syncing up, that we are speaking the same language, that we all are working from that same playbook, that we're developing and sharing that same playbook so that we can share information, so that we can collaborate as managers and as facilitators to understand what's happening with our employees and with our teammates. So what can you expect to see from the research in the future? Obviously, that's another prong of the sort of what's next sort of approach. Ideally, we'll develop better names for these behaviors. For example, did you happen to notice the one named ganging up on the task? It's very misleading. It's tough to deal with the problem if we can't even talk about it. And beyond that, we need to figure out and make it clear what facilitators and managers should be looking at and should be looking for. Right now, there doesn't seem to be sufficient guidance. And all of this should be developed into tools like self and peer evaluation systems that can help managers and facilitators to recognize these problems and maybe even assist by suggesting interventions. There are lots of resources available if you should want more information on any of these topics. Listed here is just a small sample. I know it doesn't look small, but a small sample of what this webinar has been drawn from. Of course, I'd love it if you'd reach out to me directly, because I could talk about this all day. And that ends my presentation, so I'm going to hand the mic back to Kayla. Thanks for joining us.
I'm laughing in a polite way. So anyways, well, thank you, Micah, for your great presentation. We do have just a few minutes left. We might go 1 or 2 minutes over if you can stay on the line with us. So as a reminder, if you have a question for Micah, be sure to enter it into the Q&A module at this time. Obviously, we covered a lot in 20 minutes, and there's still more that could be discussed. We encourage you to continue the conversation with Micah beyond today's session. You can see his contact information is available in the slide deck, and we will also be sending everybody a link to a follow-up blog post where he'll be addressing some of today's key takeaways. I'd also like to remind you, also mentioned it in the chat, but that we'll be sending the recording and the slides from today to the email address that you registered with. And now that I'm looking, it looks like there are a few questions coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. You start off the study by saying that you, or the session by saying that your study was originally done in higher education within that context. How do you know how it applies to corporate teams?
Sure, good question. So I draw from, there's a lot of material that has not gone into the literature reviews that I've already published, but I've been reading extensively from the literature on business context and on high-performing work groups, and there's a lot of rich literature there as well. Very little on how to fix things when they go wrong, but the other thing is I've got over a decade of experience working in teams within a corporate context, so as well as in an academic context. So that's where a lot of that comes from.
Great. I'm going to move on pretty quickly. The next question, I'm assuming, goes back to your slide around the group dysfunction behaviors. And someone was asking if you could explain a little bit more about Farrago. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Farrago, yeah. Oh, well, it could be. I don't know, actually, the correct pronunciation. I think it comes from Italian. I'm going back there right now, and I apologize, but I don't know how to go more quickly than I am. Farrago is actually a very interesting one from my perspective, because the idea here is that the Farrago refers not just to the individual, but to the group itself. And the specific instance that or the specific example that is given is sort of that person in the group who takes over control of the group unofficially, not through belittling people or anything like that, but through their sort of disrespect for norms. Maybe this person comes late to all of the meetings, and while we're waiting for this person to show up, we're discussing, where is this person? Why is he late? Why is he always late? And he effectively controls the conversation without even being there. And then in other circumstances, disregards social norms, and again, centers attention on him, not necessarily controlling the group towards a productive end, but definitely makes sure that the group is focused on this person and where this person is going. And what was particularly interesting in the Farrago literature, and I have only 2 articles on it. I only found 2 references to it. But what was particularly interesting there is that they talked about the group as the unit of analysis rather than the individual. And what that means effectively is that you don't just take that person out of the group and figure that the group is fixed, right? Yes, they seem to be the problem and they seem to be the focus of the problem, but it's really the entire group that's problematic. And because they are facilitating this, they are continuing to allow this to happen. Not intentionally, but they are allowing it to happen, and the entire group needs to be addressed. Just moving this person into another group is not going to resolve the issue. They will actually need to go through and communicate or work with the entire group. Otherwise, by breaking up the group and moving the person around, you're most likely to just spread the problem. So thank you. That is a really good question and a particularly interesting dysfunction.
It was. And actually, Micah, while we're still on this slide, do you mind telling us a little bit more about how you came up with this list of dysfunctional behaviors?
Yeah, sure. So one of the interesting things that I found in pursuing this line of research is that there was no consolidated list of dysfunctions. I had to go through I want to say that this study cited probably about 100 different resources, but I've gone through probably about 500 or so different articles and just combing them for signs of different dysfunctions. That's why, and you'd find one article that talks about, say, Farrago. You'd find one article which references rich get richer, and this paper or this particular study actually assembles these into one place. They're scattered all over the place, and there's no relationships drawn between them. They don't really discuss all of them as a larger group of group dysfunctions. It's mostly just sort of catch as catch can. So another good question, and an important piece. Another part of that is talking about how the names here are not terribly descriptive. I'm sure they were descriptive to somebody, but ganging up on the task, many people in my study were very much thrown by it because they'd never heard of it before, and when you gang up on somebody, on something, you're usually attacking that somebody. But and so in this case, what ganging up on the task is actually the situation where, as described in the literature, it's all but one person in the group dislikes the task, and they're all saying how the task is not good, and they eventually turn the one remaining person, the one person who was trying to do the work and ultimately getting overloaded, they turn them against the task as well. That's, as I said, that's how it's described, not the terminology that I would have used, and again, an indicator that we really need to talk about this stuff more out in the open so that we can come up with better, less judgmental, and more descriptive terms.
Great, and actually just covered one of the questions I was just about to get to. We have 2 left that we haven't covered. We are a few minutes over, so for those of you who stay on, great. Those of you who do have to drop off, you will get a copy of the blog post, which will address all of these questions. And so actually, since you just covered that one, we only have 1 left. You mentioned facilitators, managers, and instructors intervening. Now, how about ways for members of the group to handle the dysfunction?
Yeah, and that's what I thank you. That's an excellent question, and that's what I think is the ultimate goal. My feeling, coming from an instructional design perspective, my feeling is that the instructors need to be the first target. The instructors need to be able to understand what they're seeing. They need to be able to recognize these problems for what they are, and one school of thought might be for having to have the instructor go in and intervene by themselves, but I really think, in line with what you're saying, I think that the ultimate goal should be to have the instructors intervene as using methods designed to help the students or the participants to, A, recognize what is going on inside of their group, what is actually happening, and then to help them, to provide them with strategies so that they can, A, recognize it in the future, and B, get themselves out of it, right? I mean, that should be the ultimate goal of this, of collaborative group projects. We should ultimately set it up so that people are learning how to recognize when they're in these situations, and that they have the tools to fix it themselves, rather than relying upon some external intervention, which isn't always going to be available. Excellent question. Thank you.
Great questions. Well, it doesn't look like we have any more coming through, so we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. Thank you again to today's speaker, Micah Modell, and thanks to everyone who attended for your time and attention. We hope that you'll be joining us for our next webinar, Your Customers Are Evolving, Is Your Salesforce? This will be held on July 14th. For GP Strategies, I'm Kayla Ross, and I wish everybody a great day.